Dr. Lena Vasquez had spent 11 years of her career trying to convince people that the deep ocean was the most alien environment on Earth. And in all that time she had never been more certain of it than she was right now, sitting at her observation window 3 miles below the surface of the Pacific, watching a bioluminescent jellyfish the size of a dinner plate drift past in absolute silence. The jellyfish glowed a pale cold blue, pulsing in a rhythm that seemed almost deliberate, and Lena watched it until it drifted out of the observation window's range, then turned back to her workstation and the specimen data she'd been annotating for the past 2 hours. Hadal Station Meridian was a deep-sea research facility operated jointly by the National Oceanic Research Consortium and 3 private marine science foundations. Anchored to a volcanic shelf on the edge of the Meridian Trench, one of the deepest continuous trenches in the Pacific Basin, descending in places to nearly 7 miles below the surface. The station itself sat at roughly 15,000 feet, comfortably above the trench's deepest points but well within the Hadal Zone, the region of the ocean where pressure, darkness, and cold combine to create conditions that most forms of life found incompatible with existence. Most forms. Not all. That was the part that kept Lena here, year after year, rotating through the station's 6-month postings with the same compulsive focus that had defined her career since her doctoral work on deep-sea megafauna. The Hadal Zone was not empty. It was full of life, much of it undescribed, some of it actively astonishing, and the Meridian Trench specifically had produced more novel species per sampling expedition than any other deep-sea site on record. The station housed 6 researchers on the current rotation, plus a support crew of 4. An engineer named Rashid who kept the station systems running with calm and encyclopedic expertise. A medic named Torres who doubled as the station's cook and tripled as the person everyone came to when the isolation started grinding on them, and 2 operations technicians named Park and Osei who managed the station's fleet of remotely operated vehicles. Lena's current research focus was the Megafauna Survey, an ongoing effort to catalog and characterize the largest organisms inhabiting the trench system. She had, in 8 months of work on this rotation, documented 4 previously unknown species of deep-sea shark, confirmed the presence of giant isopods at record depth, and collected tissue samples from what appeared to be a new species of cephalopod with an estimated mantle length of nearly 4 feet. She had not yet found anything that prepared her for what the ROV cameras would show her in 9 days. The remotely operated vehicle designated Meridian 7 had been running a survey pattern along the trench's western wall for 36 hours when it came back with footage that stopped the station's morning briefing cold. Osei had been running the playback from the previous night's survey, fast-forwarding through hours of unremarkable sediment and occasional small fauna, when he slowed the feed at a timestamp around 3 in the morning and said very quietly, "Dr. Vasquez, you need to come look at this." Lena crossed the operations bay and leaned over his shoulder at the monitor. The footage showed the trench wall at approximately 18,000 feet, well below the station's anchor depth, near the limit of the ROV's operational range. The wall at that depth was basalt, dark and ancient, colonized in patches by white microbial mats and the occasional feather star clinging to a ledge. Standard deep trench scenery. Lena had seen thousands of hours of footage exactly like it. What was not standard was the shape on the ledge. It was curled, which was why she almost missed it on first viewing. Curled into the natural concavity of a large basalt outcrop roughly 2/3 of the way down the ROV's survey frame, occupying a space that looked, at first pass, like a shadow. But Lena had spent enough time looking at deep-sea footage to know when a shape had biology, and this shape had biology, the slight irregularity of a living surface, the barely perceptible motion of something breathing in the pressure-compressed way of deep-adapted organisms. "Back it up," she said. Slowly, Osei backed the footage up. At a slightly earlier timestamp, the ROV's lights had caught the ledge from a different angle, and in that angle the shape resolved. It was a fin. Specifically, it was a caudal fin, a tail fin, of a size that Lena's brain refused to process correctly on first attempt, because the fin alone occupied nearly the full width of the ROV camera's frame, and the ROV camera had a field of view of approximately 3 meters at that operating distance. A caudal fin 3 meters wide. "Play it forward," Lena said. Her voice came out completely steady, which surprised her. The footage played forward. The ROV continued its survey pattern, pulling gradually away from the ledge, and as it did, the camera caught more of the shape on the ledge. Not in dramatic reveal but in incremental, reluctant disclosure, the way very large things in confined spaces resist being seen all at once. More fin. The massive lateral sweep of a body. A dorsal surface that stretched across the ledge and beyond it, extending into shadow that the ROV's lights couldn't fully penetrate. "How long is it?" Jose asked. "I don't know yet," Lena said. She was already pulling up the ROV's depth and position data, cross-referencing with the trench wall survey maps. "Give me the timestamp measurements." Jose pulled them. Lena ran the calculation twice. The visible portion of the animal, the portion captured within the ROV camera's measurable range at that depth and distance, was approximately 11 meters, 36 feet, and it was curled, which meant the full length was something she couldn't yet determine. "That's not possible," Jose said. "It's on camera," Lena said. "I mean, it shouldn't be possible. That size at that depth, the pressure alone." "The pressure is why," Lena said quietly, and she was already reaching for her laptop, already pulling up the classification files she'd been building since the start of her rotation, already reaching for a framework to put around what she was looking at, because the alternative to reaching for a framework was standing in the operations bay having an uncategorized reaction, and she was not going to do that. Not yet. "Get me everything Meridian 7 recorded in the last 36 hours, she said. "Every frame. And let's not mention this to the rest of the station yet. Not until I know what we're looking at." Lena spent 14 hours with the footage. She watched it on the operations bay monitor, on her personal laptop in her quarters, on the small tablet she took to the mess hall and stared at while her food went cold and Torres came by twice to ask if she was all right. She watched it frame by frame, at normal speed, at reduced speed, with the brightness pushed and with the contrast adjusted, and with every image processing tool the station's analysis software had available. By the end of the 14 hours, she had the following notes in a document she had titled, with characteristic directness, "Unknown megafaunal subject A. Body plan broadly piscine. Bilateral symmetry confirmed. Caudal fin structure consistent with thunniform locomotion. The high-efficiency tail-driven swimming pattern associated with large, fast open-water predators. Visible dorsal surface suggests heavily built musculature inconsistent with the comparatively slender profile of most deep-sea fish species, which typically conserve energy through reduced musculature due to food scarcity. This animal is built for sustained power output." Coloration. Dark gray to near black on the visible dorsal surface, with no visible bioluminescent structures in the captured footage. In the deep ocean, dark coloration in a large predator typically indicates a species that does not rely on bioluminescence for hunting. It hunts by other means, pressure sensitivity, electroreception, or something not yet characterized. Size estimate, minimum 43 feet based on the measurable footage, with significant additional length obscured by the animal's curled resting posture and the ledge shadow. She ran the number 3 times and it came back the same each time. Taxonomic assessment. She stared at this line for a long time before writing anything under it. The overall body plan, the specific structure of the visible fin, the apparent scale distribution on the dorsal surface visible in one particularly well-lit frame. She had seen something like this before. In fossil records. In museum displays. In the kind of marine science papers that occupied a very specific and heavily caveat corner of the literature. She wrote, * possible relationship to Cretaceous-era deep-sea megafauna. Specific morphology suggests some resemblance to Tylosaurus or related mosasaurid lineage, though size and depth adaptation would represent extreme divergence from known fossil record. Further observation required before any classification attempt. *. Then she sat back and looked at what she'd written and thought, clearly and with her full attention, about what it meant. Mosasaurs had been apex marine predators of the Cretaceous period, extinct for 66 million years. The largest known species had reached lengths of 50 feet. They were air breathers, like all reptiles, which was among the primary reasons no serious scientist entertained the possibility of extant populations. Air breathers could not survive at 15,000 feet. Their physiology required surface access. You could not hide a population of air-breathing animals in the deep ocean without surface sightings, without evidence, without sonar returns or whale watch encounters or any of the 1,000 ways that a large marine animal near the surface eventually made itself known. But something else could survive down here. Something that had taken a mosasaurid body plan and adapted it, over 66 million years of evolution in the deepest, most isolated ocean environment on Earth, into something that no longer needed to breathe air. Something that had solved the pressure problem and the darkness problem and the food scarcity problem and was sitting on a basalt ledge 3 miles below the surface of the Pacific, being filmed by her ROV while it slept. She opened a new document and titled it, Proposed Survey Plan, Western Trench Wall. She was going to find it again. And this time she was going to be much better prepared. She sent Meridian 7 back to the Western Trench Wall 2 days later, with a modified survey pattern that prioritized the ledge system between 17,000 and 19,000 feet and carried upgraded lighting and an additional high-resolution camera array she'd borrowed from the Geological Survey kit. She told the rest of the team it was a standard megafauna follow-up run. Torres gave her an extra coffee when she said it, which suggested Torres suspected something but was choosing not to press. Rashid calibrated the ROV's additional camera package without asking questions, which was one of the many things Lena appreciated about Rashid. The ROV reached the survey zone at 11 in the morning station time, and Lena was in the operations bay with Ose running the feed live instead of reviewing recorded footage, because she wanted to see it in real time. For the first 3 hours of the survey, the western wall was unremarkable, basalt and microbial mats, and a particularly impressive colony of stalked crinoids that under any other circumstances would have been the highlight of a survey run. Lena watched it all with half her attention and ran annotation notes with the other half. At 2:47 in the afternoon, Ose said, "There," very quietly, and Lena looked up from her notes. The ledge system was back in frame. Subject A was not on the ledge. Something else was. It was longer. That was the first and most disorienting thing. Where Subject A's visible portion had measured approximately 11 meters, this animal extended across the full width of the ledge system at an angle that, when Lena ran the measurements with hands that were not quite steady, came back at somewhere between 16 and 19 meters. 50 to 62 feet. It was also more slender in its profile, the body plan suggesting a different locomotion strategy than Subject A's powerful thunniform build. Longer, more sinuous, built for lateral undulation rather than tail-driven thrust. Different species. She was looking at a second species, or a second animal of dramatically different morphology from the first. And this one was not asleep. Its head, she could see the head this time partly, was raised off the ledge, angled upward, and even through the ROV's camera at operational distance she could see that the eyes were open. They were looking at the ROV. "Hold position," she said to Ose very calmly. Ose held position. The animal on the ledge looked at the ROV for approximately 40 seconds. Then it lowered its head back to the basalt and was still. Lena sat down slowly in the operations chair she'd been leaning over for the past 3 hours. She put her hands flat on the console and looked at them for a moment, then looked back at the monitor. "I need to make some calls," she said. "And then I need you to not tell anyone what we just saw until I figure out how to tell them properly." Ose looked at her. "Doc," he said carefully, "that thing saw us." "I know," Lena said. "I know it did." She told them the next morning, in the station's main common area, with the footage playing on the wall screen and 6 people watching it in the particular silence of scientists confronting something that their training had not fully prepared them for. Dr. Marcus Webb, the station's marine biologist and her closest colleague on the current rotation, watched the footage with his arms crossed and his jaw working silently around objections he kept discarding before they became words. Dr. Priya Suresh, the station's geologist, sat forward with her elbows on her knees and her eyes fixed on the screen with the expression of a person doing rapid calculations. Dr. Emil Strand, the oceanographer, had his laptop open and was clearly pulling up literature even while watching the footage, which was such a characteristic Emil response to new information that Lena felt a brief, warm surge of affection for him. Torres watched without expression from the common area's entrance, arms folded, and Lena suspected that whatever Torres had been suspecting for the past 3 days, the footage confirmed it without entirely surprising her. Rashid watched the footage once, nodded once, and asked 3 specific technical questions about the ROV's camera calibration that, once answered, seemed to satisfy him that the footage was not artifactual. "All right," Marcus said, when the footage had run through twice. "All right, let's start with what we can establish and work outward from that. We have 2 animals, visually confirmed, of sizes significantly exceeding any known extant deep-sea species. Body plans appear superficially similar to Mesozoic marine reptile lineages, though I want to hold that assessment very loosely until we have better imagery. The size excludes anything in the current megafauna catalog," Emil said. "The largest documented deep-sea fish, the oarfish, reaches 36 feet and it's extremely slender. What we're looking at has significantly more mass. We're talking about animals that would have to be eating at a level that the trench's food chain shouldn't theoretically support. Unless they're not relying on the trench's food chain," Priya said. "The volcanic shelf this station is anchored to sits over a hydrothermal system. If there are larger vent communities lower in the trench than we've surveyed. An entire food web we haven't documented," Marcus said. "Large enough to support apex predators of this size." "It's possible," Emil said. "The trench goes deeper than we've surveyed. A lot deeper." Lena let them run for a while, the way a good discussion needed to run, and then she said the thing she'd been waiting to say since the morning before. "We need to get a closer look. Meridian 7 at operational distance isn't going to give us what we need. I want to take the deep survey submersible down to the ledge system." The room went quiet in a particular way. "Lena," Marcus said carefully. "I know," she said. "I know what I'm proposing. I'm proposing it anyway." The deep survey submersible, designated DSS Meridian, which everyone called simply the Dive, was the station's most capable crewed vehicle, rated to 25,000 feet with a crew of 2, equipped with external lighting, a manipulator arm for sample collection, and a hull constructed of ceramic composite that had been tested to pressures significantly beyond anything it would encounter at the target depth. Lena and Marcus spent 2 days preparing the Dive for the survey run, checking and rechecking systems with a thoroughness that Lena found calming in its procedural familiarity. She was, at her core, a methodical person, and methodical preparation was how she managed the particular blend of excitement and unease that had been running through her since the first footage playback. Marcus worked beside her in the same focused silence, and she knew him well enough to read the silence accurately. He was not opposed to the Dive. He was working through his reservations one by one and filing them in the same place she'd filed hers, the drawer labeled things to worry about after we get data. "The animal that looked at the ROV," he said on the second day of preparation, without looking up from the thruster assembly he was checking. "That concerns me." "It concerns me too," she said. "Curiosity is one thing. Recognition is another. The ROV is a machine moving through its habitat. Looking at it is a normal predator response. Assessment. And if it assessed the ROV as non-threatening and then we show up in the Dive, which is considerably larger, then we'll find out how it responds to larger," Lena said. "Which is data." Marcus looked at her. "That's the most alarming use of the word data I've ever heard from you." "We go in slowly," she said. "Passive lighting at first, minimal thruster noise. We observe from a distance before closing. If either animal shows any sign of active response, any sign, we withdraw immediately and come back with a different approach plan. And if they don't give us a sign before they respond?" Lena thought about the size of the caudal fin on the first footage, about what a 43-foot animal with that build could do to a submersible rated to 25,000 feet. "Then we find that out too," she said. "But I've been studying deep-sea megafauna for 11 years, Marcus, and large deep-sea animals are almost universally slow to aggression. The pressure cost of rapid movement down here is enormous. They conserve energy. They don't charge things." "You're describing known species," Marcus said. "We don't know what these are." "No," she agreed. "We don't. That's why we're going." They went down on a Tuesday station time, with the full team watching on the surface operations monitors. The descent took 40 minutes, the Dive dropping steadily through water that changed as they descended, from the pale blue-green of the upper water column through the mesopelagic zone's deep blue into the abyssal dark, the transition marked not by any visual threshold but by the change in what appeared in the external cameras. Fewer and fewer organisms, the bioluminescent sparks of passing creatures growing rarer, until by the time they reached 15,000 feet the water outside was essentially empty and black except for the occasional drift of marine snow, the slow fall of organic material from the surface world, the deep ocean's primary food source, drifting down through the dark like slow white static. The trench wall appeared at 17,000 feet, rising on their port side as they sank below the station's anchor depth. Lena cut the dive's main thrusters to positioning microthrusters only, dropping their operational noise to the minimum possible, and switched the external lighting from full spectrum to a narrowband red spectrum that fell outside the visible range of most deep-sea organisms. Ledge system should be at our 2 o'clock and about 200 meters depth below us, Marcus said, reading from the navigation display. I see the wall topography, Lena confirmed. Descending slowly, thrusters at minimum. They dropped in near silence, the only sounds the faint hiss of the life support system and the barely audible whisper of the positioning thrusters. Lena kept her eyes moving between the external camera feeds and the navigation display, watching the ledge system come into view from above and then resolve into the same basalt outcrop she'd identified in the ROV footage. It was empty. Both animals were gone. She held the dive stationary above the ledge and ran the external cameras across every visible surface. The ledge itself, the wall above and below it, the deep shadow of the trench to starboard. Nothing. The ledge was bare basalt, with a pattern of marks on its surface that she photographed carefully and that Marcus identified, quietly, as were marks from repeated contact with something large and heavy. They rest here regularly, he said. This is a consistent roost. Which means they'll be back, Lena said. Question is how long we wait. She did not have to wait long. 3 minutes later, the proximity sensor on the dive's portside hull gave a single alert ping, and she looked at the portside camera and saw, rising slowly from the deeper dark below the ledge, an eye. The eye was the size of a dinner plate. It was pale amber in the narrowband red lighting, with a vertical pupil that had expanded to maximum dilation in the dim environment, and it was looking at the dive with an expressionless, absolute focus that Lena had never seen in any marine organism she'd studied. It rose slowly, the animal beneath it ascending from the deeper dark at a pace measured enough to seem deliberate, and as it rose the camera revealed more. The broad flat head behind the eye, the jaw structure, the first suggestion of the neck and body below. The head alone was larger than the dive's crew compartment. Recording, Marcus confirmed, his voice stripped down to operational essentials. All cameras, Lena confirmed. She did not move the dive. Everything she knew about large predator behavior in confined environments said that stillness was the correct response. Movement attracted attention. Movement looked like flight, and flight triggered pursuit. The animal stopped ascending when its eye was level with the dive's primary viewport, hovering with a subtle sculling motion of its forelimbs. Yes, limbs, she registered, modified into something between a fin and a flipper, with visible structural complexity that suggested they were capable of more articulated movement than simple swimming. And it looked at the dive. And Lena looked back. In 11 years of deep-sea research she had seen things that astonished her. The ghost-white transparency of a hadal snailfish, the alien elegance of a siphonophore colony stretching 30 meters through the water column, the cold fire of a full bioluminescent display in a creature no one had ever described before. None of it had felt like this. This felt like being recognized. The animal looked at the dive with the specific quality of attention that Lena, in her most honest scientific moments, reserved for intelligence. Not curiosity in the simple predatory assessment sense she'd described to Marcus. Evaluation. The weighing of something new against a context that was already complex. Lena, Marcus said, quietly but with an edge. I see it, she said. I mean the other one. She looked at the starboard camera. The second animal was ascending on the other side. They spent 4 hours at the ledge. The two animals circled the dive in a slow, orbital pattern that gradually decreased in radius over the first hour, approaching in stages that Lena tracked and logged with meticulous attention, noting the way each approach was followed by a pause and apparent assessment before the next one closed more distance. Not aggression. Not the direct rush that a predator making a feeding decision would produce. Something more like the behavior she associated with highly intelligent animals encountering a genuinely novel stimulus. The careful, iterative investigation of something that didn't fit existing categories. She began to think of them as Subject A and Subject B, the designations from her original notes, and she built a physical description over those 4 hours that she would refine many times in the weeks that followed, if she had weeks. Subject A was the larger, more heavily built of the two, the one whose caudal fin had first appeared on the ROV footage, the one whose overall morphology suggested the most power and least speed. At close range, in the dive's cameras, the body plan resolved into clarity. A thick torso for modified limbs that operated as fins in normal locomotion but that she watched flex into more complex positions during the approach behavior, a tail that accounted for roughly a third of the total body length. The skin was dark gray with a subtle texture she needed better imaging to characterize. The head was broad and blunt, with rows of teeth visible when the mouth opened slightly during what she interpreted as a taste of water sampling behavior, reading the chemical environment the way sharks did, with sensory receptors far beyond human understanding. Subject B was longer, more sinuous, with a narrower profile and a skin pattern that was dark above and slightly lighter at the flanks, countershading that served as camouflage in open water. It moved more actively than Subject A, circling faster, approaching and retreating in shorter cycles, and its eyes, when they came level with the dive's cameras, held something that Lena, in her private notes, described as restlessness. By the end of the 4 hours she had confirmed several things. Both animals were physically capable of destroying the dive if they chose to. Neither had made any movement toward that outcome. And both of them were paying attention to the dive with a consistency and focus that suggested they were going to continue paying attention to whatever the station sent into their territory. On the ascent, Marcus said nothing for the first 20 minutes. Then, "We need to decide very carefully what we do next." "Yes," Lena agreed, "because I think those animals know exactly where this station is." The argument lasted most of the evening. Marcus wanted to suspend active survey operations and focus on passive monitoring. Additional fixed cameras on the trench wall, acoustic monitoring arrays, a careful buildup of data from a distance before any further crewed dives. His reasoning was clear and scientifically sound. They had made first contact with what were potentially the most significant biological discoveries in the history of marine science, and the most important thing they could do was not lose those animals through a premature approach that triggered a negative response. Lena's position was that passive monitoring was the right long-term strategy, but that they had a narrow window of opportunity in the animal's current apparent curiosity phase, that first contact behavior in intelligent predators typically moved through stages, and that the stage they'd observed today would give way to something else, possibly habituated indifference, possibly active avoidance, and possibly something less comfortable. "Or we push past the curiosity phase into a threat assessment phase," Marcus said. "And then we find out what threat response looks like in an animal that size." "That's a real risk," Lena agreed. "I'm glad we agree on that much. But sitting still is also a risk. If they lose interest and move deeper into the trench, we lose the opportunity to document them at all. This station is here for 9 more months, Marcus. If we don't work this properly, we may spend 9 months looking at an empty ledge and then go home with footage that the scientific community will argue about for 50 years. Emil, who had been listening without speaking, looked up from his laptop. "I ran some acoustic readings tonight," he said. "Passive from the station's hull array. Just background spectrum." He turned the laptop to show them. "Those signals started appearing about 2 hours after you surfaced." Lena looked at the acoustic display. Low-frequency signals, structured, repeating, not the random pattern of geological activity or biological noise, but something with internal regularity. "They're vocalizing," she said. "Constantly," Emil confirmed. "The signals are coming from below the station, from the direction of the ledge system." He paused. "And from another direction, from the northeast." Marcus looked at the display. "There are more of them. I can't say how many from a passive read," Emil said. "But the signals from the northeast are different in structure from the ones coming from the ledge. Different individuals, different vocalization patterns." He closed the laptop. "We may not be dealing with just 2 animals." The room was very quiet after that. 3 days later, at 2:17 in the morning, the station's hull integrity alarm went off. Lena was at her workstation, as she often was at 2 in the morning, working through the acoustic data Emil had been collecting and building a preliminary communication structure analysis for Subject A and B's vocalizations. She heard the alarm, registered it in the part of her brain that lived permanently on alert, and was in the corridor heading for the control room before the sound had fully resolved. Rashid was already in the control room. His expression, which was the most reliably calibrated expression Lena had seen on any person, told her before the monitors did that this was serious. "Hull contact," he said. "Outer structure, Section D, starboard side. Not pressure failure, physical impact." Lena looked at the monitor. The impact sensors on Section D's outer hull were showing sustained contact, not the brief spike of a debris strike. Something was pressing against the station's outer structure, and it was big enough to register across 4 separate hull panels simultaneously. "Subject A or B?" she said. "I can't tell from the impact data, but the displacement volume implied by the contact area." Rashid ran the numbers while she watched. "It's consistent with one of your animals. Subject A, based on the width of contact." She pulled up the station's external camera array. Most of the cameras showed nothing but dark water and the pale glow of the station's running lights. One camera, trained along the station's starboard exterior, showed a surface that was not the station's hull, a dark, textured expanse occupying the full width of the camera frame, pressing against the station structure with what the hull sensors confirmed was a slow, steady, exploratory pressure. Subject A was lying against the station's outer hull. It was 11 meters of visible surface in the camera frame, and beyond the camera's range there was more. "It's not attacking," Lena said, watching the pressure readings. "It's leaning. The difference matters less than you'd think to the station's structural integrity," Rashid said carefully. Section D was not designed for sustained contact loading of this magnitude. As if in response to the thought, a new alarm joined the first. Section D's outer pressure lock was showing a stress reading 20% above its rated tolerance. What happened over the next 4 hours would take Lena weeks to fully reconstruct from the station's event logs, because she was moving through most of it without the luxury of comprehensive observation. Subject pressed against the station's outer hull with what the impact sensors recorded as steady, persistent force. Not the explosive violence of an attack, but the inexorable pressure of an animal 6 times the station's mass deciding to lean its weight against a structure that had not been designed for that eventuality. Section D's outer lock gave way at 241, flooding the section's outermost compartment with water that was 3 degrees Celsius and 1,400 pounds per square inch. The inner lock held. The emergency bulkhead slammed into place automatically, sealing Section D from the rest of the station. Subject B arrived at 3:15, and Subject B was less patient. Lena was in the control room with Rashid and Torres, managing the Section D flooding response, when the contact alarms went off on the station's port side and Emil's voice came over the intercom from the science bay with a tightness that she'd never heard from him before. "Port science window is cracking. There's something directly outside." The external camera on the port science bay showed Subject B's head pressed against the observation window. The large acrylic port that was the science bay's primary viewport, 6 inches of high-pressure-rated acrylic set in a steel frame that had been tested to 30,000 pounds per square inch. Subject B's jaw was working against the frame, not biting exactly but applying a leveraged pressure to the mounting structure that was working in exactly the way a structural engineer would not have wanted. "Everyone out of the science bay," Lena's voice on the intercom, sharp and immediate. "Move now. Inner bulkhead sealed." Emil, Priya, and the operations technician Park were out of the science bay 30 seconds before the port window gave way. The sound of it was something she would not forget. Not a crack exactly. A conversation between pressure differentials that ended very suddenly and very loudly, and then the rush of water and the slam of automatic bulkheads, and then a different alarm, lower and more serious, that Rashid identified in a flat voice as structural compromise in the science bay's primary load-bearing frame. They had lost Section D and the science bay in 47 minutes. They were losing more. Lena pulled the entire team into the control room and ran a damage assessment with a speed and clarity that she was dimly aware was going to feel different later than it felt in the moment. Section D. Flooded. Sealed. Inaccessible. The outer pressure lock destroyed. The inner lock holding the emergency bulkhead secured. Lost. Science bay. Flooded. Sealed. The primary viewport and its frame destroyed. The structural damage to the bay's load-bearing system was the more serious issue. Without knowing the extent of that damage, They couldn't know whether the station's overall structural integrity was compromised or merely locally damaged. Current animal positions. Subject A had moved away from the station's starboard side after the Section D flooding, pulled back to an uncertain position that the limited external cameras couldn't fully track. Subject B was still in contact with the station's port side, the camera showing its body pressed against the station's exterior below the sealed science bay. "It's listening," Emil said, watching the contact sensors. "The contact pattern isn't structural loading, it's tactile. It's running its head along the hull. Reading vibrations," Lena said. "Finding out where we are inside," Marcus said. "Remaining compartments secure. The control room, the crew quarters corridor, the mess and medical bay, the engineering section, and the docking module where the dive and one smaller emergency ascent vehicle were housed. Power, 60%. The station's fuel cell system running normally. Life support, intact, though running on reduced capacity with 2 sections sealed. Communication. This was the item that Lena's eyes stopped on in the damage report and stayed. The station's primary antenna array was on the outer hull of Section D. The backup antenna was in the science bay. Both were gone. They were 3 miles underwater with no way to communicate with the surface. "The emergency transponder," Rashid said, answering the question she hadn't yet asked. "Hull-mounted unit, independent power, activates automatically on major hull breach." He paused. "It activated when Section D flooded. It's transmitting. How long before someone responds to an emergency transponder at this depth?" 12 to 15 hours at best, Rashid said. "More likely 24. Subject B's contact sensor spiked as she looked at that number. On the external camera, the animal had turned its head toward the docking module. There were 4 options. Lena ran them aloud for the team with the particular focused bluntness of someone who knew that the time for extended deliberation was something they no longer had. Option 1. Stay in the station and wait for rescue. Advantages. The remaining compartments were structurally sound as of the current assessment, life support was functioning, and the team was safe as long as the animals did not breach the remaining sections. Disadvantages. They had no way of knowing how long the structural integrity of the compromised load-bearing frame would hold under continued contact loading. They could not communicate to clarify their situation, and they had 2 animals actively investigating the station's remaining compartments. Option 2. Ascent in the dive, full crew. The dive was rated for 2. It carried emergency capacity for 4 with extreme overcrowding. They were a team of 10. It made one round trip possible with 6 people, but that left 4 people in the station for however long the return trip took, and the dive's ascent and descent time was 40 minutes each way. Option 3. Split between the dive and the emergency ascent vehicle. The EAV was a simpler system, a one-time use ballistic ascent capsule rated for 6 at emergency capacity, no propulsion, purely ballistic. It would ascend from the docking module release point and surface wherever the current took it. No navigation, no control. But it held 6. 4 in the dive, 6 in the EAV. Everyone gets out in one deployment. Subject B is currently between the docking module and open water, Marcus said. "I know," Lena said. "The docking module release bay opens on the port side. I know that too. So we open the docking module, and we're in the water 30 feet from whatever Subject B is doing to our hull." "Yes," Lena said, "which is why the dive goes first, not the EAV. The dive is bigger, louder, and more interesting. If we time it right, the dive draws Subject B away from the release point and the EAV launches into clear water." "And the dive?" Marcus asked. Lena held his gaze. "I'll be in the dive." The room was very quiet. "You're not doing this alone," Marcus said immediately. "I need you in the EAV making sure those 6 people get out safely," she said. "I need Rashid in the dive with me because the dive systems require 2 operators at full capability." She looked at the rest of the team. "The EAV runs on autopilot to the surface. Marcus leads that group. Rashid and I take the dive." Another alarm spoke from the hull sensors, lower in pitch than the earlier ones. A new contact point on the engineering section's outer wall. The station's remaining structure shuddered, very slightly, and Lena felt it through the soles of her boots. "We go now," she said. They moved through the station in two groups, quickly and without lights in the outer corridors. Lena and Rashid had decided that reducing internal lighting might reduce whatever visual cues the animals were reading from the station's exterior. At the docking module entry, Lena ran through the dive's pre-launch checklist at speed with Rashid, both of them working from memory the way they'd each done it dozens of times, trusting the procedure that training had built into their hands. Marcus organized the EAV group with the same focused efficiency she'd expected from him. Torres, Emil, Priya, Park, and Osei in the EAV, everyone accounted for, everyone with a station emergency pack, the EAV's pre-launch sequence running. "When we release," Lena told Marcus, one hand on the docking module's inner door, "you wait until the dive has Subject B's attention before you trigger the EAV. I'll key the dive's active sonar at full power the moment we're clear. That should be loud enough to pull anything in a half-mile radius toward us." "And then," Marcus said, "then you go up. Don't wait for anything else. Don't wait for confirmation from us. You go." Marcus held her gaze for a moment. He was not a man who made speeches in difficult moments, which was one of the many things she respected about him. "Come back up," he said. "That's the plan," she said. She went through the inner door. The dive released from the docking module at 4:42 in the morning station time, and the first thing Lena registered as they cleared the docking bay was how large Subject B was when seen from the outside, in the water without the intermediary of a camera feed. The animal was directly above and to their port side, its body stretching across the full width of the station's exterior in a sinuous line that vanished into the dark at both ends. Its head was pressed against the engineering section's hull, the contact sensors Lena could still read on the dive's telemetry link showing a steady exploratory pressure. Rashid had the dive's active sonar ready. "On your call," he said. "Now," Lena said. The sonar hit the water at full power and the effect was immediate. Subject B's head came off the station's hull with a motion that was sudden and fluid and absolutely without wasted movement, and the amber eye tracked instantly to the dive. The animal's body pivoted in a way that should not have been possible for something of its length, executed with a speed that would have been shocking in an animal a tenth the size. It was looking at the dive, fully, completely, with its full attention. "It's working," Rashid said quietly. "Keep the sonar on intermittent pulse," Lena said. "Give it something to track." She brought the dive's thrusters up to half power and moved them away from the station, along the trench wall and south, drawing Subject B away from the docking module's release axis. Subject B followed. Behind them, on the telemetry link she was still maintaining to the station, she saw the docking module's EAV release signal fire. The EAV was away. She exhaled one controlled breath and turned her full attention to what was directly in front of her. Subject B was not pursuing the dive. It was escorting it. Lena made that assessment in the first 5 minutes of movement away from the station, watching the animal's behavior on the external cameras with one eye while navigating with the other. It was not closing the distance in the way a predator making a feeding decision would close it. It was maintaining a fixed interval, approximately 30 meters, and matching the dive's course changes with a fluid precision that demonstrated both an intimate familiarity with the trench's three-dimensional geography and an understanding of the dive's movement patterns that went beyond simple reactive tracking. It was hurting them. The realization arrived fully formed and cold, and Lena sat with it for a moment without acting on it, because acting required understanding where the hurting was directed, and right now the direction was south-southwest, which in terms of the trench geography meant deeper. Away from the station, away from the ledge system, toward the trench's deeper sections that she had marked in her survey plans as UNCHRACTRIZD, meaning the ROVs had not gone there and she had no data on the terrain. "It's pushing us toward the trench floor," Rashid said. "I know. Don't fight it yet. Lena, if we fight it and it decides we're a threat instead of something to be managed, we find out very quickly what Subject B does to threats." She checked the depth gauge. They were descending as well as moving south 19,000 feet and dropping. Right now it's treating us the way it would treat another animal it wanted to move, which means it hasn't decided we're a threat yet. I want to keep it that way long enough to figure out where it's taking us. Subject A joined them at 21,000 feet. It appeared from the deeper dark ahead, not from behind, not from the sides, but rising from below to meet them, and it positioned itself ahead of the dive at the same fixed interval Subject B was maintaining behind, and the geometry was now absolutely clear. They were in a corridor. Subject A leading, Subject B following, the dive between them, descending into the deep trench in what was, without question, a deliberate and coordinated escort. They were being brought somewhere. At 24,000 feet, a depth that the dive's rated ceiling was technically just above, at 25,000, a margin that Lena was very aware of, the trench wall fell away on both sides and the geometry changed. She had been expecting a continuation of the narrow trench system, the same vertical basalt walls and narrow floor she'd been reading on the navigation display for the past 40 minutes of descent. Instead, the display showed an expanding void, a broad oval chamber, formed by the collapse or volcanic subsidence of the trench floor at this depth, roughly 200 meters in its longest dimension and 60 meters high. A natural room at the bottom of the world, sealed on all sides by basalt and accessible, as far as she could tell from the navigation data, only through the narrow trench passage they had just descended through. And it was full. The external cameras resolved the chamber gradually as the dive's lights penetrated the dark. The floor was visible first. Not bare rock but something layered and complex, the accumulated material of what she eventually identified as a constructed substrate. Large basalt slabs repositioned. Bioluminescent organisms she'd never seen cultivated in patches that provided a cold, dim ambient light. The temperature, according to the dive's sensors, was slightly warmer than the surrounding trench water, which suggested a hydrothermal microvent somewhere in the chamber's floor system. And the eggs. She saw them at the edges of the cultivated bioluminescent patches. Large, dark, leathery spheres, the largest roughly a meter in diameter, settled into depressions in the repositioned substrate in clusters of 4 to 8. She counted 11 clusters before she stopped counting and said, very quietly, "Rashid, I see them," he said. "They built this," she said. "The substrate arrangement, the bioluminescent cultivation, the thermal management. They built this. Which makes this a nest," Rashid said. "And we are inside it." Subject A had stopped ahead of them. Subject B had stopped behind them. The dive sat in the middle of the chamber, surrounded by 11 clusters of eggs and 2 animals that had brought them here with deliberate, coordinated intent, and Lena looked at the external cameras and understood, with a clarity that was both scientific and something more personal, that she was the first human being who had ever seen this. The first egg she noticed moving was in the second cluster from the dive's port side. It was a subtle motion at first, a slight distension of the outer membrane, a ripple that ran across the leathery surface and then was still. She watched it for 30 seconds before she was certain it was real and not a trick of the chamber's dim bioluminescent light. Then it happened again, and the egg beside it responded with the same ripple, and the egg beside that one, a wave of movement running through the cluster like a slow pulse. "They're hatching," she said. Rashid didn't answer immediately. She could hear him doing the same rapid reassessment she was doing, the same recalibration of a situation that had just changed its parameters again. "Subject A and B are stationary," he said, reading the external cameras. "Neither has moved since we stopped." "They brought us here to see this," Lena said. She did not say it as a certain statement. It was hypothesis, and a hypothesis with extraordinary implications, but it was the explanation that fit every data point she had. The escort, the corridor, the destination. Not threat behavior. Something that had no clean word in her scientific vocabulary, but that her non-scientific mind reached for a different term for entirely. Presentation. The membrane of the nearest hatching egg split along a seam that looked almost too clean to be organic, and through the split, a limb emerged. Small, comparative to the adults, roughly the size of her forearm, but with the same structural complexity she'd observed in the adult's modified fins, the same evidence of articulation that went beyond simple propulsion. The limb pushed against the leathery membrane and the split widened, and a head came through, and the head was recognizable despite its strangeness, recognizable in its proportions, in the quality of the amber eye that opened for the first time in the cold bioluminescent light of the chamber and found, almost immediately, the dive's lights. Young. It was a juvenile, newly emerged, perhaps a third of a meter in total length, and it looked at the dive with the same quality of focused attention that had been running through this entire encounter from the beginning. Lena was crying, she realized distantly. 11 years of deep-sea work, and she was crying in a submarine at 24,000 feet because she was watching something brand new come into the world, and it was looking at her. The dive's structural integrity alarm went off at 24,700 feet, 400 feet below rated ceiling, and broke the stillness of the chamber with a sound that brought both adult animals off their stationary positions in an instant. The alarm was not the hull integrity alarm. It was the pressure seal monitor on the dive's forward viewport, a warning system that indicated a seal had begun to fail. Not a catastrophic failure, not an immediate breach, but the early warning of a developing problem in a component that, under normal circumstances, she would have addressed by returning to the station. At this depth, the failure rate of a compromised viewport seal would accelerate with every additional foot of descent. They were already beyond rated depth. She needed to go up. Subject B was between the dive and the chamber's only exit, the narrow trench passage they descended through. It had moved to that position the moment the alarm sounded, with a speed that told her its apparent stillness had been coiled readiness rather than relaxation. "It thinks the alarm is a signal," Rashid said. "Some kind of threat signal." "It is a threat signal," Lena said. "Just not the kind it's interpreting." She looked at the forward viewport seal monitor. The pressure differential reading was climbing. "We have maybe 20 minutes before that seal fails." Subject A had moved to the center of the chamber, positioning itself between the dive and the hatching egg clusters, which told her something important about its current priority structure. It was protecting the juveniles, not blocking the exit, which left Subject B between them and the exit. She opened the dive's external speaker system. She had used it once before, during the initial dive, to broadcast a low-frequency acoustic signal that mimicked the vocalization patterns Emil had recorded from the station's hull array. An approximation, a rough translation of signals she didn't fully understand, addressed to animals whose communication system she had spent all of 4 days beginning to study. She played it anyway because it was what she had and the seal monitor was still climbing. Subject B did not move immediately. Lena held the dive stationary and played the vocalization signal on a loop, watching the external cameras with the focused attention of someone reading a language by watching faces rather than understanding words. Subject B's body language was unreadable by any standard she had available. She did not have a framework for interpreting posture in an animal this different from anything she'd studied, and she was building the framework in real time under conditions that did not favor methodical observation. The seal monitor climbed to 60% of failure threshold. She made a decision, keyed the dive's thrusters to minimum power, and moved toward the chamber's exit passage at the slowest possible speed, watching Subject B and ready to reverse the moment anything in the animal's behavior shifted toward direct interception. Subject B watched the dive approach. At 15 meters, it moved not to intercept, not sideways across the passage, but up. It rose along the passage wall, clearing the dive's direct path while maintaining visual contact, and the motion was so precisely calibrated to the dive's approach speed that it could not have been accidental. It was letting them pass. Lena moved the dive into the passage and began ascending, the trench walls rising on either side, the navigation display scrolling upward through depth readings as they climbed. Behind them, on the rear camera, she could see Subject B following at the same 30-meter interval it had maintained on the descent. Still escorting. The seal monitor climbed to 70%. She pushed the thrusters to standard ascent speed, trading silence for time. At 20,000 feet, Subject B stopped following and held position. She kept descending. The viewport seal failed at 19,000 feet. It did not fail catastrophically. It failed in the way that a compromised seal at depth fails, with a fine, high-pressure jet of water that entered the crew compartment in a stream thinner than her finger but cold as the absolute void outside and under pressure that cut through the air in the compartment like a blade. Rashid had the emergency sealant compound in his hand before she'd finished identifying the failure point, and he applied it with the efficient certainty of someone who had spent years maintaining systems that did not allow for hesitation. The spray reduced to a drip, then stopped. "Hold?" she asked. "For now," Rashid said. He did not sound confident, which was the most alarming thing Rashid could do. "The compound is rated for this depth. Whether it holds through the remainder of the ascent depends on whether the seal continues to degrade under the changing pressure differential." "How likely is continued degradation?" "Fairly likely," Rashid said, with the flat honesty she had always valued in him and valued now more than ever. She pushed the thrusters to maximum ascent speed. The seal held through 17,000 feet. Through 15. The drip came back at 13, and Rashid applied a second layer of compound, and Lena watched the depth gauge and did not look at the viewport seal monitor because looking at it was not going to change what it told her. The drip became a stream at 10,000 feet. "Rashid," she said. "Still holding," he said. The sealant compound tube was empty. "With what I have. 8,000 feet. 5. The stream at 3,000 feet was the width of her thumb and cold beyond description, and the crew compartment had taken on several inches of water across its floor, and Lena had both hands on the thruster controls at maximum power and was watching the depth gauge with the complete, undivided attention of someone for whom that number was the only number in the world. 1,000 feet. 500. The surface was a brightness above the viewport that she saw before the depth gauge said 0, a gray-green diffusion of surface light at the end of a long ascent through darkness, and she drove the dive upward into it with everything the thrusters had left. The dive broke the surface at 6:12 in the morning, Pacific time. The exterior, in daylight, looked like what it was, a deep-sea submersible that had spent time beyond its rated depth with a compromised viewport seal, the frame showing stress deformation at the forward section, the lighting array on the port side dark from a power fault that had developed somewhere around 15,000 feet. The crew compartment floor had 4 inches of water in it. Both Lena and Rashid were wet to the knee and cold in a way that had moved past shivering into the numb simplicity of a body that had decided to conserve heat rather than generate it. The emergency transponder signal from the station had been received and relayed 14 hours earlier, and the rescue vessel they had not known was coming was 3 miles out when the dive surfaced, visible as a white shape against the gray morning sea. The EAV had surfaced 6 hours earlier, 9 miles from the station's surface coordinates, and all 6 of its occupants were aboard the rescue vessel, alive, with hypothermia risks for 2 of them that Torres was already managing. Marcus was on the rescue vessel's bridge radio when it connected to the dive's surface comm unit, and he said her name with a quality of relief that she would think about for a long time. "Everybody's up," she said. "We're both up." "I know," he said. "We've been tracking you for 4 hours." The dive's transponder. He stopped. Started again. "Lena." The rescue vessel's sonar picked up some readings during the night. Large biological contacts in the trench system. Very large. "I know," she said. "Do you want to tell me what happened down there?" "Yes," she said. "I really do. But I need to be warm first." She wrote the report over 3 days, in a bunk on the rescue vessel with a thermal blanket around her shoulders and a laptop whose screen she stared at for long stretches without typing anything, which was not how she normally wrote scientific reports. The problem was not the facts. She had the facts, the footage, the dive sensor logs, the acoustic recordings, the depth and position data. The facts were meticulous and comprehensive and would, she was fairly confident, constitute the most significant marine biology discovery since the coelacanth. The problem was the parts that fell outside the facts, and whether to include them in a document that would be read by people who hadn't been in that chamber. She included them. She wrote about the coordination of the escort behavior and what it implied about the animal's cognitive and communicative capabilities. She wrote about the chamber itself, about the repositioned substrate and the cultivated bioluminescence and the thermal management, and what those things implied about a level of environmental modification behavior unprecedented in any non-primate marine species. She wrote about subject B clearing the exit passage, and the calibration of that movement, and what she believed it indicated about the animal's capacity for intentional decision-making in novel situations. She wrote, "I went into the trench believing I was looking for unknown megafauna. I came back believing I had made contact, however brief and incomplete, with a non-human intelligence of a kind and origin we have no prior framework for. I am aware of how that sentence reads in a scientific document. I am including it anyway because the alternative is omitting the most significant observation from the most significant discovery of my career, and I am not willing to do that." Marcus read the draft and didn't change anything. He added his name as co-author, which told her everything she needed to know about what he'd thought during the hours he'd spent on the rescue vessel watching the dive's transponder signal rise toward the surface. 6 months later, Lena stood at the bow of a research vessel 300 miles off the Pacific coast and watched the surface of the water in the early morning light. Hadal Station Meridian was being rebuilt. The consortium had approved the funds within a month of her report, with an expedition budget that was, by any measure she'd worked with in her career, extraordinary. New hull reinforcement specifications. A substantially revised structural rating for large-scale contact loading. An acoustic monitoring array that could cover twice the area of the original. 2 new deep survey submersibles, built to 30,000 feet. There were arguments still in the scientific community about what the footage and sensor data showed. There were people who looked at her report and found ways to categorize the animals as known types, to find familiar frameworks and force the data into them. She'd expected that. She'd been doing this long enough to know that genuinely new discoveries spent years being argued into existence. She wasn't interested in the arguments. She was interested in going back. She thought about the chamber at 24,000 feet, about the bioluminescent light and the repositioned basalt and the eggs in their clusters. She thought about the juvenile that had looked at the dive with its first opened amber eye. She thought about Subject B rising to clear the exit passage with a precision that she had spent 6 months analyzing and still believed was intentional. She thought about her report's final line, which she'd written at 2 in the morning on the rescue vessel with numb hands and a thermal blanket and absolute certainty. *, we are not alone in the deep places. We never were. We simply had not gone far enough to find them. I intend to go further. *, the surface of the Pacific was gray-green and flat in the early light, ordinary in the way that all deep water looks ordinary from above, calm, featureless, giving nothing of itself away. 3 miles below the surface, in the dark, something ancient and alive and watching moved through its world with the patient certainty of something that had been here long before the ships above it, and would remain long after the ships were gone. And somewhere above it, heading toward it, Dr. Lena Vasquez was coming back.